couple of questions about dialogue and engaging in dialogue with people. So the first issue that I face is I have a very high need for intellectual stimulation, and I can't get that with most people. It's something like you can have a dialogue for a time, but then
it's high trait openness. Yeah.
But then they sort of run out of ideas, and they can't keep up, and it sort of falls apart. And I think this is a problem that intellectuals have quite frequently, is that they sort of, once they start reading difficult and rewarding stuff, they stop wanting to talk to regular people, and I think that contributes to the disconnect that you see between intellectuals and working class people and stuff like that. And the other question I had was about...
Okay, wait, I don't know if that's a question. I mean, I believe there's a question in there, but
The question is, how should we address that? How should I address it? And is that something that can be addressed?
Well, part of the answer to that is that's what the universities were for. I mean, you know, not everybody is equipped to or interested in engaging in high-level discussion of abstract and creative ideas. You know, you hear this idea that everyone's creative. That's a lie. It's as straightforward as that. True creativity is very, very rare. And so, and if you happen to be a creative person, or if you happen to be someone who's profoundly interested in ideas, you are in a pronounced minority. Just as you are if you happen to be extremely extroverted, or extremely agreeable, or extremely conscientious. These are minority issues. And what you do is you find like-minded people who are capable of engaging that. You know, heavyweight weightlifters compete with heavyweight weightlifters for a reason, and everyone thinks that's fine. And the same thing applies to intellectual and creative endeavors. So what you do is you try to find a community where that's the nature of the community, and you likely have to find a relationship like that as well. You know, so I don't think so. I think what contributes to the siloing is the arrogance that goes along with it. Because if you can be interested in ideas and you can be creative, well, that's the arrogance of the intellect, right? That's the thing the Catholic Church had warned about for centuries, is the arrogance of the intellect. So because if you're wise as well as smart, and there is no relationship between being smart and being wise, they are not the same thing. There's no quick pathway from smart to wise. And many of the people who I've known who were very wise well, some of them were intellectually impaired and were still wise, you know. So it's the arrogance that brings up the block. And I see this, for example, happening in the United States in particular, because the last time I went down there, for example, I had friends down there, and some of those friends are very, very smart people, and some of them were talking about the Trump voters, and they were talking about the Trump voters with contempt. And I thought, you better watch that, because that's 50% of the damn population. And it might be convenient to think that they're stupid and beneath you, but it's not conducive to a civil state, and there's no evidence that it's true, because there isn't a straight line between intelligent and wise. And so I think that if your character is developed and you're intelligent, you can have your siloed creative community, but you develop enough wisdom so that you can see all the things that people can do that are of high ethical utility that are outside the intellectual domain. You know, and I think that's why in the New Testament, I think that's why Christ is a carpenter. I had a friend at one point who was a very bitter person. And he had a bunch of problems, and some of them were self-inflicted, and some of them were fate, I suppose. And he had become very, very destructive, murderously destructive, genocidally destructive, I would say. You could see it in his dreams. And he lived with me for a while. And I knew him very well. He was a friend of mine from the time I was 12 until the time he committed suicide, when he was about 40. And when he lived with me, I was trying to help him get on his feet, which was why he had come to live with me, because he thought maybe I could help him get on his feet. And he could only take relatively low-level jobs, you know, like he had some mechanical ability. He didn't get educated, although he's a very, very smart person. He probably had an IQ of about 135 or something like that. He was very smart, and so he was bitter too, because he hadn't educated himself to the level that his intellect would have demanded. So he had to take jobs that were beneath him intellectually, and he had that real intellectual arrogance, you know, because he was smart. And really smart people often come to believe that only smart matters, and if they're smart and all that and all that matters is smart, and then the world isn't sort of laying itself at their feet, then they've been terribly betrayed. And then they cling to their intelligence, which is more like a talent or a gift, like it's an idol, a false idol, which is exactly what it is, and a very dangerous one, and get cynical about the stupidity of the world and the fact that their talents weren't properly recognized. And that's just not that helpful, because smart is a good thing, but I'll tell you, if you don't use it properly, it will devour you, just like all arbitrarily assigned talents, right? So you might have a talent, but it's your friend if you use it properly, and if you misuse it, it will be your enemy. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is an intellectual figure. And you see that motif emerge very frequently, by the way, in popular culture. So, for example, in The Lion King, the figure of Scar, who's a satanic figure, is also hyper-intellectual. And that's very common, that, it's the evil scientist motif, or the evil advisor to the king, the same motif. It encapsulates something about rationality, and what it seems to encapsulate is the idea that rationality, like Satan, is the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom. It's a psychological idea, that the most powerful sub-element of the human psyche is the intellect. And it's the thing that shines out above all, within the domain of humanity, and maybe across the domain of life itself. The human intellect, there's something absolutely remarkable about it, but it has a flaw, and the flaw is that it tends to fall in love with its own productions and to assume that they're total. Solzhenitsyn, when he was writing the Gulag Archipelago, had a warning about that with regards to totalitarian ideology. And he said that the price of selling your God-given soul to the entrapments of human dogma was slavery and death, essentially. And Satan, in Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan decides that he can do without the transcendent. He can do without God, and that's why he foments rebellion. It's something like that. And the consequence of that, the immediate consequence from Milton's perspective, was that as soon as Satan decided that what he knew was sufficient and that he could do without the transcendent, which you might think about as the domain outside of what you know, something like that, immediately he was in hell. And when I read Paradise Lost, I was studying totalitarianism, and I thought, the poet, the true poet, like a prophet, is someone who has intimations of the future. And maybe that's because the poetic mind, the philosophical or prophetic mind, is a pattern detector, and there are people who can detect the underlying, it's like the melody of a nation, melody as in song, the song of a nation, and can see how it's going to develop across the centuries. You see that in Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, for example, in the around 1860 or so, he prophesied what was going to happen in the 20th century. He said specifically that the specter of communism would kill millions of people in the 20th century. It's an amazing prophecy. He said that in the notes that became Will to Power. And Dostoevsky was of the same sort of mind, someone who was in touch enough with the fundamental patterns of human movement that they could extrapolate out into the future and see what was coming. And some people are very good at detecting patterns, and Milton, I think, was of that sort. And I think he had intimations of what was coming as human rationality became more and more powerful and technology became more and more powerful. And the intimation was that we would produce systems that dispensed with God, that were completely rational and completely total, that would immediately turn everything they touched into something indistinguishable from hell. And Milton's warning was, and it's embodied in the poem, is that the rational mind that generates a production and then worships it as if it's absolute immediately occupies hell.